Yeah, great.
Tony.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on Thursday, February 8th. This is our usual day for interviews, and I'm excited today to be interviewing Jason Rheins. I think this is the first time I've had you on the show. Yeah, that's all right. I should have had you earlier, but I'm sure we'll have you again. So thanks for joining us.
Well, see how it goes first, and
True. You know, you never know, Jason. There's always that element of surprise. So Jason is a philosopher. He got his PhD in philosophy from some significant university, University of Pennsylvania. That's right. And I met Jason when he ran the Objectives Club at Stanford University when he was an undergraduate. I think he was 12, something like that. It seemed that way, but no, he was a little older than that, but he was young. And Jason was also a philosophy professor at Loyola University in Chicago, and is now a fellow and instructor at Aun Rand University. He's taught classes at the Ayn Rand University. So yeah, and I saw Jason in Austin, I don't know, 2 weeks ago, I think it was.
Yeah. For a very, very lively talk on Israel's moral war.
Yes,
gave a great talk.
A lively talk. Lively response to my relatively lively talk, but yeah. So Jason you wrote your dissertation on Plato, is that right?
Plato's theology, yeah.
On Plato's theology.
And I've been working on a book about that for forever. So
to recall something like that forever, yes, about a book Jason is going to write. But
I'm writing it. It's just taking me forever.
Yeah, good. Well, one day it'll be done. And but Jason has a lot. I mean, he's incredibly well educated in Greek philosophy, but more broadly in Greek culture, and more broadly than that in intellectual history and in philosophy, the history of philosophy, and in history. I mean, there are few people actually in the world that I know that know more than Jason does, just in terms of the amount of knowledge stored in that brain of his. It is truly astounding. And it's not just stored there by itself. It actually gets integrated. So, which is really cool. So, so what I thought we'd start, because I came up with this idea of the rise and fall, which is obviously not an original idea, but we attended a session in Austin with some of our fellow objectivist intellectuals. Ben Baer was there, Greg Salameri, and we were talking about intellectual history. And some of this context came up of kind of what explains the decline of Greece and Roman civilization, and then what explains the rise of the Renaissance, and then the seeming threat that we're living through right now. Maybe it's more than a threat; it's a reality of really a decline of Western civilization, of a decline in the achievements of the West. So I thought we'd do kind of obviously it's going to be, however long we do this, it'll be brief because that history is long. But I thought we'd start with Greece. I mean, there's a lot of talk about Greece was wonderful. There's a lot of talk about Greek philosophy, but I don't know that a lot of people know, okay, what was really wonderful about Greece? That is, what is it that made Greece special? What were the ideas that were uniquely Greek, and how did those ideas impact the culture within Greece?
Sure. Yeah. So it's helpful, I think, to start out by talking about a time when Greece was not special. So there was a I mean, it's not that it wasn't a very sophisticated civilization, but it just, if you go back to the Bronze Age, from say 16 to 1200 BCE, Greece, the Mycenaean civilization is impressive, but it looks much like the civilizations you have around the Mediterranean and Near East. Centralized palace structures with a priesthood and a kind of king, an economy that all runs through there. Art that looks like other Near Eastern stuff. The Minoans, whose language at least was not Greek, actually have much more vibrant and interesting art. But that was in the Bronze Age. Around 1200 BCE, there's a vast collapse of Bronze Age cultures. Egypt is just about the only place that kind of doesn't go backward society-wise, but even it is somewhat destabilized. And at that time, so in the Bronze Age, the Greeks had a writing system. Each symbol was a syllable. They lose that. They lose writing. It's really you have to imagine a post-apocalyptic scenario where they have gone back technologically, intellectually. But by about 400 years later, 800, say, BCE, they have regained writing now based on the Phoenician alphabet. And then they turn some of the letters into vowels. And their population begins to boom, so much so that Greek cities throughout Greece and Ionia, which is the western coast of modern Turkey, which is all Greek, and Magna Graecia, like the Sicily and southern Italy, Greek cities from there send out colonies as far as Odessa, which was originally a Greek city, as far as Marseille.
Don't tell that to Putin. I mean, there's a war with Greece.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah. So they just it explodes, and this is the Iron Age now. And from about 800 to 600, or 800 to 500, is what we sometimes call the Archaic period in Greece, and that shows a rise of very strong or independent city-states. Each is called a polis, which is where our word political comes from. And they have various kinds of constitutions, but they all have certain things that are interesting about them in comparison to other parts of the world. So you see, at least among people who are considered citizens, more of a more ability for non-aristocracy, say, to participate politically and so on. But the really big innovations politically begin around 509 BCE when Cleisthenes in Athens, they overthrow the Pisistratid dictatorship, and then they establish the first democracy. More than a century before, Solon's reforms had made some of that a little more possible for it to grow a middle class and so on. But the democracy really begins at the end of the 6th century. And then, and now I should say, from about 600 BC on, we do see something very interesting in terms of Greek philosophy. And we have the beginnings starting in Ionia, the southwestern part of Turkey. You do see the beginnings of natural science as we understand it and philosophy. So I mentioned all this because I wanted to contrast the earlier part. So here are the differences. When the Greeks make a comeback, as it were, and they regain writing and so on, here's some of the interesting things about their civilization that are not necessarily true before. They do not have kings, really. Sparta had 2 kings, but they're just in charge of the military, and they're not ruled by monarchs like so many of these other places. They don't have a priestly caste, say, unlike the Hebrews, unlike the Magi in Persia, right? So there are priests at like local places, and sometimes that's hereditary, but any Greek at any time can erect an altar and make an offering to a god. That has a really big impact on how their culture grows. And you have these different local cities. So one of the things you see is that they are an extremely competitive culture. It's sometimes called agonistic. Pick some endeavor in which a human being can show excellence. The Greeks will make a contest to see who's best about it. They had poetry competitions. They had pottery painting competitions. They had, like, it's Eurovision to the next level. And that has an impact on their intellectual development, because you don't see that same kind of thing, say, in China. Now, some of that's because of a huge purge of intellectuals by the first emperor of China. But even early on, you find Greek poets, and there's no, they all revere Homer, but everybody wants to be the next Homer, and they don't hesitate from taking shots at Homer to be the next guy. So there isn't this automatic reverence for anything in the past. People want to be the next thing. So there's competition, there's innovation, and there's a decentralization of power in a number of different ways. And that's what starts it. That's not what makes it great, but that's what those are.
So this is how this is the start. You've got some political freedom. You've got the beginnings of philosophy. You've got beginnings of science. What does it reach? That is, where does it get to at its height? What does it look like at its height in terms of a culture, civilization?
Yeah, at its height. So I would say it reaches its cultural height a little bit after it has reached its political height. So the political height, I think you see in the 4th century BCE, when you have both some independent city-states and leagues of democratic city-states coming together and in self-government. But then Philip II, Alexander the Great's father, conquers Greece. Then Alexander takes that over, and then his various successors have these large, huge kingdoms that spreads Greek culture and ideas across the Near Eastern world, which is cool. But as far as India, but it does change the kind of politics. Although there is some, in some places, local freedom, but that's the political height. But culturally, I think it kept, and scientifically, economically, you see, I think, somewhere between 3 and 100 BCE, things are just kind of getting better and better. You have Alexandria, the great library there. It becomes an incredible center of mathematics and even mechanical invention. You have a flourishing art, which not only is there, the kind of great classical art from 500 to 400, but then Greek art kind of goes through its romantic period in the Hellenistic era from 300 to the turn to the Common Era, and it's much more emotional. You see much more kind of personal values. You get novels about lovers who are separated and things like that. So, and then intellectually, I mean, you get, in a sense, the height philosophically is Plato and Aristotle, from about 400 to 320 BCE. But it doesn't stop there. Then the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Skeptics keep it going. And we do get lots of new issues and debates in philosophy and new concepts, which are pretty integral. But in terms of mathematics, it keeps progressing and so on. And in a sense, it doesn't really, I mean, there are some people who would say Greece doesn't end until 1453 AD, when Byzantium is finally conquered by the Turks. Yeah. And I mean, by that point, it's unrecognizable, but there is a sense in which, if you went to a certain Greek cities in 600 of the Common Era, they'd be Christian, but in other ways, they would still look rather Greek and rather sophisticated, certainly economically and things like that. Yep. But really, I mean, really what's amazing about Greek intellectual life in the classical era, say from about 500 to 320, and then the Hellenistic era, is it's not that the Greeks don't invent math, they don't invent astronomy, they don't invent stone carving or anything like that. They take them from older civilizations that they have a lot of respect for, and then they innovate in rapid ways that nobody has done before. or had done, but in a very limited way. And they do it in a much more rapid scale. And intellectually, owing a lot to Plato and Aristotle, Greek math, Greek science changes and becomes, if it already sort of was, but then with them, it really cements into a search for causes and explanations and proofs. So other parts of the world do math that was ahead of the Greeks in certain respects, and then other parts of the world would advance beyond them mathematically in certain respects. But one thing that's sort of different about Greek math, let's say, from Plato's time on, is that other places you'll have amazing sort of solution procedures. Like if you want to find this, here's what you do. Or if you want to do that, right? And but what you don't have are these proofs in the same way. There is this interest of show me why of necessity this has to be the result, and you have to be able to get this. That's quite unique and remarkable. And then in science, you see other places where they have tech that the Greeks don't have and other practical discoveries, but you don't have the same kind. Some places it emerges, it doesn't catch on, but the same kind of search for causes of like what's making this and what's making that happen, and then how do we explain it?
So would you say that there's certain searching for cause and effect that exists in Greece because they're philosophical that doesn't in other cultures?
Yeah, yes, in math and science, it seems like it's so. Now, it's possible that there was some of that, say, in some places, and it got wiped out. But yeah, I mean, the China, for example, so nobody is so expert in the ancient languages and the ancient texts that they can really do the history of science in Greece and the history of science in China. There just is, that person doesn't exist. But the guy who's come, who's the kind, one of the top people of Chinese history, Nathan Sivan, one of the most famous names in Greek science, G.E.R. Lloyd, they collaborated together, which is the next best thing.
Yeah.
And they did a series of kind of studies, and Lloyd often looks for kind of sociological explanations and causes, and some people can find that in a way not intellectualist enough about causation, like it's not enough about the ideas making things happen, but he does make some of these points that I'm making about social differences and how the Greeks behave. But anyway, Sivan and Lloyd, they pointed out in Chinese philosophy, you don't get a concept like the Greek concept of nature, and that's a game changer. This sort of deep inner identity of something that is responsible for all these things that it does, and so on. And then
concept, I don't know if you know the answer to this, but I've always been curious. I've never seen it, but does Chinese philosophy have the concept of reason and logic?
Yeah, well, so this is really not my area, but I will say you have in the early Confucian writings, you have what we call in philosophy moral psychology, where you're looking at people's behavior and people's thoughts and emotions and so on, and you start classifying things up in sort of different faculties or states. So you do have, for example, in Mencius's Confucian Analects, you do hear about like a good heart and a bad heart, and it's something like somebody who actually thinks long term versus somebody on whim and so on. Now, it's not quite reason yet. I don't know if they had something like that, but there's certainly, you can see parallels, that they're on the same kind of path. And I mean, if it's an interest, if you ask me, like, when did Greeks have the concept reason as we know it? Like, it's actually a little bit tricky because, I mean, in the generation after Aristotle, people start using the term logos, which means a speech or an account, or more or less as how we might use it. And they can just refer to all the other non-human animals other than the gods as alagos, as the unreasoning brutes. And so there's a single word, right? Prior to that, in Aristotle and Plato, the thing that's closest is nous, which is intellect, smart,
Mm-hmm.
and then phronesis, which is wisdom or making good decisions, but it's also associated with knowing. So it's actually kind of late in the game that it all comes together as one clear concept. But you can get a lot done piecemeal, like a concept of this kind of thinking and a concept of that. And so,
So how would Aristotle have conceptualized what he was doing when he was doing science, kind of in a sense, coming inductive science, or and then when he was doing logic, did he see, or, deductive logic, did he see those as being, in some sense, all part of an epistemological conception? Or...
yes. So it's actually funny where he would put his own logic and his sort of overall science, because, well, no, I think he would be part of what he called first philosophy. Um, so for Aristotle, reason, the highest kind of part, and the uniquely human and God's part, really has two aspects. Theoretical reason, the part of our reason that just knows things and that deals with things that cannot be otherwise. And then practical reason, which deals with things that might go one way or might go another and deliberates. And within the domain of theoretical reason, there are really three broad sciences: mathematics, theology or first philosophy or metaphysics, and then physics, which is all natural science. Whereas when you start using practical reason, there are sciences like politics and ethics and rhetoric and other things like that. And then there are applied or productive sciences like the crafts. So I'm sure he thought of his logic, the analytics, as part of theoretical science, just describing these forms of argument and so on. And yeah, I mean, his theory about what a science, at least as it's complete, looks like, or what an explanation looks like, is closely tied to his picture of deduction. Now, that doesn't mean he thinks you achieve scientific results deductively. That's not his view at all, but it is important to how he sees it. Yeah. I hope that wasn't too roundabout an answer. I have a tendency to go on. I'll try to be a little brief.
Okay. Okay, so Greece is this obviously amazing culture. Scientific progress is being made, mathematical progress is being made. That culture spreading to places like Alexandria and others. It has an impact on Rome, I take it, on
enormous impact on Rome.
Yeah.
I should say, I do want to make one point. Greece, interestingly, in some ways has many less hang-ups about sex and sexuality than we do, even today, as a result of Christianity. That said, however, classical Greek culture is profoundly misogynistic, in a very deep way. Women just were not supposed to leave the house. Even the Romans, in some way, were less so. So, at a Roman drinking party, you would bring your wife. You would never bring your wife to that for the Greeks. She would stay home where she, and just work on her weaving.
Yeah.
And but there'd be dancing girls and flute girls there, so that's fun, but
or dancing boys, as the case may be. Right. I mean, humanity is on a phenomenal path at this point. Maybe not so much politically. Greece descends into kind of monarchies, and then Rome descends into an empire and ruled by authoritarians. But the culture is still alive and thriving and successful. What are the forces bringing that to to an end, really, certainly in the Western Empire, and to some extent in the Eastern, as nice as we might think. What do you call it? Byzantine was. It wasn't Rome of the first century.
Yeah, it's hard in some ways. That it is hard to say, and what I mean here is, in some ways, it's very hard to, at certain points in the BCs and then maybe the first century or two AD, to really get a clear sense of like what the intellectual or philosophical vibe is. We know about different schools of philosophy. It's harder to get a sense of which was ascendant and what impact was it having. But things were, in general, in certain ways, say from the ADs on, getting more superstitious and more mystical, even before Christianity was a major force. That was already happening among Greek pagans. It's just getting spookier. Some of that comes over from Babylon by way of astrology, but you might also say it now had a market when it didn't before. It's hard to say. But
you're an expert in Plato's theology. To what extent is this Plato's impact?
He has it. Yeah, he has an impact. There is a period of time where Plato and Aristotle are a little bit sidelined, and the Stoics and Epicureans and skeptics are in charge. But by the first century BC, by the end of the first century BCE, dogmatic Platonism is back. In some ways, it probably just moved to Alexandria and was festering there. It makes an impact. It's almost impossible to find any kind of mystical thinking that doesn't show, or that we don't strongly suspect bears the mark of Platonism. Just to give you an example, so the earliest Judaism, but also the earliest Christianity and the earliest Islam, on the day of judgment, your corpse will get back up. It is corporeal resurrection, if there is some future life. It's not your soul that exists in some other dimension. That's Plato. And the extent to which any of any of the Abrahamic monotheisms think of the afterlife in terms of where your soul goes is Plato, because the actual Abrahamic thing is way cruder than that.
Yeah, I mean, in original Judaism, there's no afterlife. That's a concept that seems to be introduced later on. It's not in the Old Testament, as far as I can tell. As far as I remember.
No, there's Sheol and Gehenna, but that's, in a way, that might just be we put you in the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does come about later. So a lot of that stuff is very, very. It's ultimately, Plato has an enormous role for that in that growth of mysticism. I think that's fair.
So in the early part of the ADs, mysticism is rising.
Yeah.
Do you think that prepares the ground for kind of the widespread adoption of Christianity?
Yes. Yeah. So people point out that there's it's almost, before there were memes, scholars had these sort of memes, and they're like, here's a guy, and you hear a bunch of things like some say he was the son of God, and he performed this miracle, and he did this, and they did this, and you're like, who is it? And you're like, Jesus. No, it's Apollonius of Tyana. There were a whole bunch of these weird apocalyptic miracle working guys all over the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. People are looking for this. The other thing is, even early Christianity is not all one thing. It's a dozen different things. And then there are a bunch of things that are, say, Gnostics, where is it Christian, or is it Jewish, or is it pagan? And it's this whole milieu of all this stuff. And I definitely think it's in that ferment that Christianity gets going. And it, in some ways, you might think it had some of the appealing bits of Judaism, but it wasn't it wasn't a tribe's culture, and it didn't have all the ritual observances that make Judaism a pain. You can just circumcise your heart. Oh, that's good.
Popular Judaism. It was
Yeah.
a for the masses.
Yeah. And it was actively proselytizing. But yes, I mean, I think this stuff, Christianity wouldn't have gotten going the way it did if that wasn't the kind of cultural vibe. But it's also the case that if Constantine hadn't converted the empire, who knows what would have happened. It really does make a big difference when the church gains state power. I mean, for one thing, it's only at that point you can start to say there's the church. Prior to that, 5 bishops, like the Bishop of Antioch, of Alexandria, of Rome, of Jerusalem, one other place, they're, at least symbolically, they're equal, but it's clear that Alexandria and Antioch and Rome are the big ones. But like each one, a bishop he's a prince, basically he can make all these decisions. And even still, like there are many different theologies of Christ, many different views. Was he a human? Was he God? Is he this? Is he that? There was way more ideological diversity among Christianity, its theology, than there is today, way more. And it's only when the state wants this to be a state religion that they're like, yeah, we're going to settle this. And the people who aren't on board on this version are going to die. That,
Yes, I think the First Council of Nicaea was set down the law, and then they kept doing it
the Council of Chalcedon, and then it's funny. I sometimes say it's funny that they picked the most irrational version of Christianity. Well, let me say, right. So there's one version that says this is sometimes called adoptionism. Arianism is one way it goes. And the idea is Jesus was, the son of Joseph and Mary. He's born a human being. And then God, during, say, his baptism in the Jordan River by John the Baptist, God adopts him. And now you have to understand that, like, legal adoption was very common in the Roman Empire. Most of, like, the emperors were only the sons of the previous empire through legal adoption. But that was a big thing. And so the idea is, God adopted him. That's when he became God's son. Okay, that makes sense. God could do that. Or another version is, okay, yes, he's a projection of the divine spirit. Yep. He's not a human being. He's like a hologram or a ghost. So he couldn't have really died on the cross. Anyway, a God should be immortal, and you shouldn't be able to harm a God, So that was called Docetism. But like either one of these makes way more sense than he was simultaneously man and God, and he has both natures, but only one nature, but it's also 2, and also 3, but not 1, but also 1. So like they pick the most incoherent one.
And like they envisioned Hegel before he existed, right?
Yeah, something like that, or he took inspiration. But I think that, here's the thing, right? Like, it's a faith. And you might think, I don't know if this is true, but this is like a hypothesis I sometimes entertain. It's just a hypothesis that among these various kind of competing things, it's the most irrational one that might win out, or might win out with power, because it's the one that most of all says, yeah, you just have to nod your head even though it makes no sense. Because in a way, none of these make sense. It's just some of them make a little more sense. But if you're willing to if all that this is about is whether you can compel a person to say 1 = 2, then make them say 1 = 3.
Interesting. I like that idea. It makes sense to me. And it could very well be part of the political calculation of Constantine, in terms of, okay, I want people to take this on faith, and that's a kind of a bending the knee.
So what I've always read is that he personally did not care which theology they picked, as long as they picked.
To kill the guys who disagreed, yes.
Well, I think it was he wanted it so that they would stop arguing.
Yep.
And they could kind of they could stay on message by having a message. But I don't know. That may look. I should say like that may be completely unfair to how the patristic debates of Christology were going. It's just something I like to think about sometimes. And I will say,
Yeah.
to this day, like the Coptic Church is the result of monophysitism, which means only one nature. So he was man, then he was God, but it wasn't. And when they went that way, and the the official church went the other way, that was then the Coptic Church Egypt breaks off. And it has been argued that had the Byzantines not been so inflexible about that, they might have kept Egypt during the Arab conquest. It might have remained a thing, and that ultimately cost the most. Anyway, but I don't know.
So Christianity, becomes dominant for political reasons to a large extent, and because the culture is ready for it. There's no real. It doesn't seem like there's much opposition to it post Constantine. There's some resurrection but
yeah. So Julian the Apostate,
yeah,
the Emperor Julian tries to
flips it.
flip it, but I'll say right, like so if the alternative at that point is Neoplatonism, and in some ways it looks tidier intellectually than kind of paganism had before, but it's as mystic, if not more so. So it's not like it would have been. I mean, it would have lacked some of the pathologies of Christianity, but it would have had its own.
So
it wasn't as poisonously altruistic.
Yeah. So would you say what kills kind of that Greek spirit of inquiry, of looking for cause and effect, of science, and kind of human happiness, is what kills it is Christianity would have probably died anyway? Is that where the ideas were going? And what is it about Christianity that actually kills it?
Okay, so there are a couple things here, and some of it I think I don't know that we know. Well, first, some of it is what would have happened if not for this or that. That's always
Sure.
kind of a guess. But
Sure.
okay, so I think that you never get a fully worked out and totally satisfactory rational egoism in Greek philosophy. And I think, in a way, if you don't get it close enough to that, it's quite possible you will backslide as long as you accept a certain amount of sacrifice into the code. It'll come to dominate more and more. And then the other thing is just the growing, I think, mysticism. Now, what's unique about, or relatively unique about Christianity compared to other Near Eastern and Mediterranean stuff, is the degree to which it is the degree to anti-selfishness, you might think, and anti-happiness and anti-justice, you might think. As Jesus says, right, like you love your friend. Well, even the Greeks do that, right, and hate their enemy, but I want you to love your enemy. Nobody really thought that, because that's crazy, in a certain sense. Plato did this. Plato said, the just person does not harm his enemy. Now, that doesn't mean you don't kill your enemy. If your enemy is bad, killing them is actually good for them. But he thinks the just harm no one, which is to say, the just don't make anybody else bad. It's no part of being a good person that you make other people worse, right? But that was as far as he went. Even he didn't think the just they're equally nice to scoundrels as they are. That would be unjust.
Mm-hmm.
So, like Plato will say something like, look, it's better to suffer an injustice than to perpetrate it. I agree, right? And that was very radical. But he wouldn't have said, so go ahead, give them your coat as well. He wouldn't say, turn the other cheek. That is quite unique with
So that
Christianity.
altruism is unique. And it's and the mysticism that is embedded by this in this perspective of Jesus and the irrationality and the contradiction embedded in this seems unique.
Yes. So as much as people might have been interested in Platonism and its otherworldliness and so on, it didn't inspire the same kind of monasticism that Christianity did. It's also the case that people who were rich, who became interested in it, they stayed rich. They made and they continued to kind of contribute to their cities or the emperor in a kind of pro-social way. Whereas Christians in the 4th and 5th century, rich Christians began giving away their money at large to hopeless causes in a way. Like, so no longer was it, I'm going to build a theater and everyone's going to enjoy it, or I'm going to build a park or an aqueduct and, you know, have Pac Bell Aqueduct on it and have honor and so on, which was how big giving had previously looked. We sometimes call it civic ergotism, doing good deeds for the community that you're a part of. Instead, it became, let's throw away money on the poor and really think of it as pouring water on the desert sand. Why? That was the quickest way to just dispense your money, because it is easier to enter the kingdom of heaven for a rich man than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. And then people would also say, whatever treasures you give away in this life, you store up as treasures in heaven. And people took that literally. They actually thought that the more money they gave away and just threw away, the better their next life would be in some quasi-material spiritual way.
Yeah. So let's so really by 500-600 AD, that spirit that is the Greek spirit and the early Roman spirit is kind of gone, certainly in the West. But then it comes back, and I was gonna, what do you think leads to going back in the Renaissance or leading up to the Renaissance? Of course, it's not just one event; it's not one point in time. But what is going on there?
Well, I mean, a couple things. I think you have a couple of centuries of fairly vibrant intellectual and artistic development in the Muslim world.
Yes.
The trade is extraordinary. The technology is growing. The scholarship is impressive. They want to learn things. They're figuring things out. Baghdad is the cultural center of the world. I mean, it's a positive culture. And
it's all linked to kind of the conquest of Byzantinian cities, particularly in Syria, and the discovery of Greeks.
Yeah. So it's pretty early on. After about a century, perhaps, you start seeing Islamic philosophy based upon Greek philosophy, the Mutazili, and then later the Kalam movements. Yeah, and it's very impressive.
And it's science, it's mathematics, and physics.
Yes, they extend Greek science in all these different respects, and Greek philosophy, and so on. And they have extraordinary bodies of literature and so on. So that is a lively culture. And there's a sense in which Europe, in a way, gets a shot in the arm, a kind of transfer of vitality from its engagement, albeit an antagonistic engagement, with the Muslim world and the Crusades. But not just the Crusades, but through trade by way of Spain and other places, their learning becomes European learning.
Well, certainly Spain, I think when the Christians start conquering Spain, they're discovering the libraries that the Muslims discovered in Syria, 500, 600 years earlier. So it's that transmission belt of ideas and knowledge is continuous. Yeah.
One thing that's hard to kind of figure out, so it's become fashionable today for medievalists. So medievalists have never really, or at least most of them have never really loved the term Dark Ages, but their antipathy for that has accelerated. Now, there's two things, right? So one is the High Middle Ages are not a dark age.
Yep.
But you might think, but the Dark Ages, that period of like 600 to 900 AD in Europe is pretty dark, right? But even now they're trying to change that. And
They are.
so I don't really take that part very seriously or credible, but it is true that the 13th century, like the 1200s, and even the 12th century, the 1100s, are showing remarkable amounts of intellectual and cultural recovery in some ways in Europe. And I think it's plausible to think that had the Black Death not completely devastated Europe in the 14th century, that the Renaissance would have happened perhaps 200 years earlier.
Mm. And so let's talk about what set off the Renaissance. Kind of, I know Rand talks about Aquinas and Aquinas bringing kind of Aristotle into embracing Aristotle within the kind of the Catholic Church, and struggling with the idea of reason versus faith as kind of the spark that sets off the Enlightenment. Not the Enlightenment, the Renaissance. Walk us through what's going on during this period, particularly post Aquinas.
Okay. Yeah, so Aquinas is 13th century, and he's in France. So he's one of a number of European scholars who are reading Aristotle, usually in Latin translation, from a translation in Hebrew, from Arabic, from Greek, or from Syriac to Arabic to Hebrew. It's a long chain.
Yeah.
He is not the most Aristotelian of them by any means. There are other philosophers just before and around his time who I consider better, spiritually, intellectually. I mean, he's a brilliant guy, but he's a Christian at the end who uses Aristotle rather than an Aristotelian who sneaks it into Christianity. He's not that. Or it's 50-50. And it's also, I think it's a bit of I kind of think backwards looking history that, since Aquinas became the church father, of course he dominated. I don't think that's an entirely accurate picture of what was going on. Like, other people were reading other things, but what he is emblematic of is that Christians have started reading the works of Aristotle, and that following Islamic commentary on the works of Aristotle and other Greeks. And you begin to see in the 1200s the building of universities around Europe, or the forming of universities. At first, they're not a physical campus so much as groups of students, student unions, so to speak, that hire and get permission to hire faculty. And the faculty come and they lecture on medicine, Roman law, because they now have Justinian's Code, Aristotle, and logic, or theology. But that creates a big intellectual ferment. So the Renaissance, in terms of philosophical influences, like the Italian Renaissance, what actually happens is a bunch of fleeing Byzantines, when the empire collapses, come to Italy, and they increase the knowledge of Greek, which had been trickling in. So you get a huge translation of Greek literature, and that excites the artistic imaginations, the poetry, and so on. In terms of philosophy, people start reading Plato a lot more, actually, not Aristotle. But the mere fact that they have this much more vibrant and this worldly culture to study and create art about and so on seems to kind of ground it in certain ways that are very healthy. And I think that's sort of what at least the Italian Renaissance is about.
So somebody asks here, where is it? Why the Renaissance? So why? I mean, this is why the Enlightenment rises in a Christian civilization, not Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, or Taoist. But there's also a question about, did Genghis Khan destroy Islamic the Islamic Golden Age. So what happens in Islam that prevents it from
So
reaching, continuing on this path? Because it stops at some point, or at least the progress stops.
yeah, so it's not Genghis Khan, it's his son who sacks Baghdad, but he did devastate it. It is said that the rivers ran red first with blood, then black with ink, and destroyed the greatest libraries in the world. That had an impact for sure, but other places carry forward the culture. So southern Spain, Cadiz, and the Andalusian kind of Renaissance, Persia and parts of Afghanistan. So it's not as if it all got wiped out. It was getting, in some ways, the philosophy became stagnant. Let's put it this way. If you look at like Avicenna and then the centuries of just recycled Avicenna after Avicenna, it looks like the worst kind of scholastic medieval stuff that people like Descartes and Galileo and so on are complaining about. Now, some people say, well, oh, it's Al-Ghazali. It's not. His influence is not as transformative, I think, as people think. He's a Shia and he's Sufi. It's not the game changer some people think. He's not the Islamic world's Kant or something. It's just I don't know why there was a failure to launch, but it seemed to at certain points stagnate and fall behind Europe in other ways. It wasn't always obvious it would. There was a time period where it looked like the Turks could take over Europe. They were the most technologically advanced. They had cannons. They had all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, but
that's not totally satisfactory. But I mean,
yeah, but they never had a Renaissance in the sense that Europe had a Renaissance.
Yeah,
and even the technology they developed was, a lot of it was borrowed from cultures to the east that they were trading with,
from China,
and there was very little innovation within those cultures. It seems like post 13th century, outside of Spain, where I think there is continued progress in Islamic culture, Islam really does start decaying, even with the Ottomans.
Yeah, so I mean, you see tremendous work in mathematics and extraordinary scientific work in astronomy and navigation, stuff that really that in some ways allowed the European Renaissance to become an age of exploration. If they didn't have the sextant and other Arabic tools, it wouldn't have happened.
Absolutely.
The astrolabe, I should say, the astrolabe. Yes.
So let's see. So what would you say characterizes the Enlightenment? Do you see it as first of all, do you see it as kind of a continuation of the Renaissance? Is that one kind of thread that goes from the Renaissance through? Is there a real shift there? And then what are the characteristics? What is exciting about the Enlightenment?
So I think that there is a continuity in the sense that with each new successive generation of intellectuals, it becomes possible to give to the magisterium of reason more and more, and faith is correspondingly diminished, until it basically becomes possible by the end of the 17th or 18th century to say faith is out. There's nothing to recommend it that isn't just reason regurgitated, and it's reason that has authority to answer all questions that we bring before the human mind. That is the distinction of the Enlightenment. And so Kant, in his essay, What is Enlightenment?, I think does identify what is essential to the Enlightenment. Yep. It is human beings entering their maturity, which is to say, it is human beings realizing that everything is to be turned to the authority of reason, even reason's own powers and limits, and that's how we're going to decide questions. So it is, and you do see something equivalent, similar among the Greeks in the 5th and 4th century BCE. There's a period where suddenly they, just about any human practice you can imagine, they go, is this natural? Is there a point to this? Is there a good way to do it? Is it just? Even things like slavery, they're willing to consider just about anything. It's anything goes. And I think you get that again in the 18th century for Europe. That's what I think, that is the essence of the Enlightenment, in particular, because the 17th century had shown such enormous successes in natural science. The idea was, we can continue this in the social realm. We can ask, what are the smart, true, rational ways for human beings to live? And the same thing happens in Greece, that first you see a successful application of reason to nature, and then it looks inward and goes, well, what about us?
Yeah. Yeah. So this idea of that slavery is an evil, that exists in pre-Roman, among Greeks pre-Rome.
Aristotle, in book 1 of the Politics, in the place where he defends natural slavery, says there are those who say and argue that all slavery is contrary to nature and therefore unjust. We don't know who those people were.
Yeah.
But he says it, and then he agrees with them, or some people like them, who think that Greeks enslaving other Greeks, or civilized people enslaving other civilized people, is unjust. It's only when someone who is literally, in some sense, mentally deficient is the slave to someone that he thinks it's just. Now, he's utterly wrong, but that's a normal human occurrence. It's not when he thinks it is. But yes, so there were people who we don't know who. Similarly,
I'll just interject this. I'm saying that because I just read Dominion, this book that tries to say Christianity invented everything good in the world. But one of the claims he makes in there is that no, it was first Christians, I think under Gregory, that came up with the idea that slavery is bad. This is the first time really in human history this became a significant view presented, even though it was dismissed at the time.
No, and
sound right when he said it didn't seem right when I read it, but yeah, it's good to know.
And it's also the case that there were debates about how to treat your slaves, where some people had better views. Plato complains in the Republic that one of the annoying things about democracy, at least like in Athenian democracy, is like the slaves are so rich and allowed so much leeway that you can't even tell who's a slave and who's a free man on the street. Now, he complains about this, like, this is a problem. It shouldn't be that way. But that was the way it was. And comedians, like Aristotle, they're always complaining about, like, the slaves are richer than we are now because they started a bank or something like that. The intellectual sources that we have from antiquity are not the most, in a way, progressive by not just current left wing, but in general, like European small L liberalism perspective. The pro-democrat, there are voices that must have been there, pro-democracy, pro-business class, that we don't have. We mostly have voices that reflect old landed aristocrats who don't like all these greedy merchants.
Yep.
But we know that there were arguments on the other side. And, Plato gives us one or two hints of, and Aristotle, one or two hints of what the versions of their arguments were. And they're pretty good. So there were better views. There was a kind of lost liberalism that we don't really know about.
So, so the Enlightenment is this, again, maybe a little bit like Greece, this amazing period of intellectual development. Science is going, is being pursued, and I was just reading about Diderot, and you have to come to the conclusion. They were even questioning kind of the Christian sexual mores, right? I mean, Diderot is pretty racy in his views on sex.
Yes.
And I mean, he's quite a character and really fascinating. I
Yes.
didn't know much about him other than the encyclopedia, but once you actually read about what he wrote, it sounds really amazing. So again, Rand describes kind of this, at least intellectually, the killing of the Enlightenment is done by Kant. So maybe you can walk us through, what that means and how he does it. And then maybe we can talk about kind of the remnants today of kind of this conflict that still exists, I think, around the Enlightenment.
Sure. So, first I want to point out that in some respects, the fault lines in the weak points, the weak foundations philosophically of the Enlightenment are there before Kant. If you look at D'Alembert's preliminary discourse, and he talks about the state of all the sciences, he begins by talking about the state of philosophy. And there's some stuff, shows a lot of influence of Locke. And it's good in the sense of knowledge begins with the senses and so on. But then it very quickly goes to, we don't really know what the external world is like, and we can't know this, and we can't know that. And you realize like the domain of things that he thinks we can't have knowledge about is vast. And it's only going to get more, it's only going to be exacerbated. At the same time, you have, yes, some of the sexual mores, some of the monastic virtues of Christianity are being attacked, and rightly so. You do not have a rebirth of egoism. You don't, that part Christianity won. And I think more than
some attempts at it, right? So
there are little bits.
And Helic, what's his name? Helic. Oh, somebody's actually asked him about this guy. Where is it? Helic, Helvetius. Are trying pleasure, pain. They're trying to come up pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. So Christian Wolff has perfectionism and stuff. But it's interesting. Like you see Wolff's students and defenders bending over backwards to say, "Oh, but this is not egoism." Even when it's more Aristotelian. So that doesn't change. And when people attack Spinozism or they attack atheism, usually it's enough to just say something's atheistic. But if they need to go any further, they will say, and without fear of God, you wouldn't do this and you wouldn't do that. And some of it is you'll kill your grandmother for pocket change. But some of it's you won't tithe and you won't be charitable and you won't be meek. Now, I wanted to say those is what are the kind of fault lines that are already there, and I think given enough time, those would have cracked. But you can think of Kant as taking an iron spike and a mallet and hammering them really hard, and in novel ways that make the kind of accommodations that were going on no longer possible. So let me describe two things. Kant completely kills the rationalist project of which in a way is good. If you look at the rationalist stuff he's attacking, it's absurd, pie in the sky. It's just spinning your wheels, making stuff up. And he rightly says this is all BS. But it was also, those were the people who still thought we have to prove God's existence, and we can, and then we'll prove this and we'll prove that. And it was bogus, but at least it suggests they still thought that was a valid demand to try to prove that. And Kant kills that project. Any attempt to revive it, say like with intelligent design movements and stuff, is always profound, is far more intellectually dishonest than it was the first time around, because nobody really buys. But he leaves room for faith, and argues that for moral reasons you can hope for these things like God and the future life and things like that. And so then the thing to look at is his morality. Well, let me say one more thing about his metaphysics and epistemology. Kant, you had in earlier European philosophy, a kind of notion that there is a veil or there's a gap between what's in our heads and what's in the world. And there you have people kind of stuck in their heads trying to figure out how we can get out of it and know something. And it gets more and more skeptical. But Kant, in a way, puts his finger on the fundamentals. And I will say, he's a genius. He absolutely sort of sees what's going on and takes the next step. That is, all the superficial things, in a way, that people are arguing about, he jettisons, like, that's superficial. This is what it's really about. And in a sense, he's right. That's what it's really about. And he takes the wrong view. So he makes it really the case that any notion of something kind of coming into our consciousness in a certain way is going to be cut off from real reality. And that will have profound ramifications for how people think about the power of reason moving forward. The other thing is that in morality, he makes a concept of duty central, and it's far more powerful. Here's one way to think about it. He takes the worst part of Christian ethics and he makes it defensible to secularists, to philosophers. It's not about, there's a voice from an old man on a mountain, and he said that part's gone. Now it's just the voice of reason itself, but it's all the kind of the worst things about the morality distilled down. And that's incredibly damaging. And it solidifies into moral philosophy something that had come along with Judaism and Christianity, but now becomes like a feature of just how people think about ethics at all. And that is, instead of thinking about ethics as, oh, how do I live my life? What's a good way to be happy? Something like that. Ethics is now a rule for deciding if this is naughty or okay or permissible, right? And utilitarians, they want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, but they still think like, is this okay? Is this naughty or nice, right? Like, that's what morality becomes. And that really begins with the Abrahamic religions, and God tells you this. But it becomes, but now philosophers, instead of thinking, what are the virtues and how do I live a good life? And they just think naughty or nice. And that's profoundly damaging. I will say this. I think Rand seems to say in various places, and I think she's right, that in a way, by the Enlightenment, mysticism would have been dead, but altruism brought it back. Yep. So even despite those problems I've mentioned in their epistemology and metaphysics, I still think, faith would have been dead if it hadn't been that it was only through faith that people could justify their morality. But people will go to any length to justify, so a moral code will let people justify anything to themselves, and they will go to any length because they need a code. And I think that's what happens.
So, we got we got a ton of questions.
Let's go. Yeah.
Let me, let's take these questions and then we'll see. Some of them will get us back into this. Some of them are a little out of left field, like the first one, but it's $200. So I have to treat it.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
Right. This is a free will question. Consider the following thought experiment. Part one, you find yourself in a situation where you have to choose between two options, A and B. You choose A. No one and nothing forced you to choose A or prevented you from choosing B. You chose A out of your own free will. All right. Part two. Now imagine that some advanced alien scientist had observed this and was able to rearrange all the atoms in your body and all the atoms in your immediate environment to the exact state where they were the instant before you made that choice. Would you still choose A? Do you have any choice?
Okay, good question. So what this is getting at, essentially, is that metaphysically, the metaphysical condition that anybody who isn't a compatibilist who doesn't think, oh, we're determined and there's free will, but free will is this watered down thing. Anybody else thinks there has to be the possibility of something alternative. So the principle of alternative possibility, we call it. So all things being exactly the same, could you have done otherwise? Or does anything ever happen that does not happen of necessity, right? Now, there's no way, in fact, an alien could do this because you were not the copy of an alien doing a free will experiment, and the copy of you that's a copy of an alien for a free will experiment is. So there's already a sense in which it cannot be identical. But that doesn't matter, right? It's probably enough if you made a carbon copy, physically at least, of me, and you put him in a room that was indistinguishable from the room that I was in, and you gave him options A and B. I am of the view that it is possible, if it was possible for me to choose B, it is possible for him to choose B. And he might do it and not choose A. Now, here's the thing. Whatever view, and what that suggests is that if free will is real, it must be the case that the entire state, say, of my brain at some time is necessary but not sufficient to determine what it will become. And that's and physics will have to explain how that happens. But now, it's not as if all of physics is deterministic. It hasn't been for 100 years, I should say. But anyway, now,
a kind of a mechanistic understanding.
Yeah, by deterministic, I mean one input, one and only one output.
Yeah.
So that, and I'm not saying it's probabilistic. If it was random, even random with different chances, that wouldn't be self-causation. It has to be I make the choice. But how consciousness does this, we don't know. But now, but here's the thing. When you say option A and B, it just sounds like two labeled buttons and there's no point, right? And it may be that, look, if A and B if they are actual options, then the copy of me is going to have my values and is probably going to think thoughts similar to me. Now, if I was on the fence and maybe I could have gone for B, then he might. But if it was something where I had some moral principle at stake and I chose A, I don't think that copy of me is ever going to choose B. But I don't think that means anything, because there's a mistake in thinking that because nothing determines us, that nothing influences us or plays a role. The challenge is explaining how, on the one hand, yes, our values and our experiences and our past thoughts and deeds constrain the realm of possibility for us, make certain things more likely for us to continue to do and others less likely, but that within those constrained spheres, there still remains an absolute core of freedom where I could do one thing or not do it and do something else.
Good. Dave, if you have a follow-up, now's the time. All right, Adam asks, if I understand Rand correctly, she believes once a culture becomes more and more anti-reason, the harder it is to reverse that trend. Do you see in history that this intellectual inertia is more difficult than momentum in the opposite direction? Theories as to why?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that requires I'm trying to think of a scale at which there's enough resolution to talk about, a kind of relative period of more irrationality and then a period of greater rationality. And I mean, like, I can think of, there were periods in American history that show big religious revivals, and people seem to get dumber, and then they seem to simmer. But it's not clear if that's a change in people's thinking, or just the ones who think that way are more vocal and making more of a nuisance of themselves. I don't know. I don't know why. Let's put it this way. here's a possibility that once you have a negative turn in a culture based off of some deeply held and bad philosophical premise, things will not get better until you start to address that. Now, conversely, when you have a good fundamental philosophy, like a kind of Aristotelian philosophy, until its foundations have been weathered away, and even a little bit after that, things will grow, you'll have new technology and so on until it runs out of steam and everything collapses. I don't know if one of them is easier or harder to reverse than another. I will say this: it's harder to reverse the descent into more irrational culture if you were just coasting on a good but imperfect thing from 1,000 years ago. Yeah. Because unless someone new introduces a new source of rationality, you don't have anything, right? Whereas more people can just repeat the same old bad things, and that'll have the same negative effect. And remember, death is the default. So, and us behaving like our primate cousins is the default, unless we choose how to be better.
Yeah, we can see that all around us. I mean, so, you know, in a sense, the culture we live in today is still cruising on on the good of the Enlightenment. I mean, there's plenty of enlightenment around us, and it's actually stunning how good life is in spite of Kant and, you know, everything that he's spurned since then. So how do you see that? How do you see how that plays in? I mean, we had Kant, but then we had Industrial Revolution. We've had 200 years of incredible progress.
So it takes a really, like the conveyor belt kind of thing that Rand talks about. I think we have to understand it on the scale of centuries. Centuries, plural, right? For it to fully work its way into a culture, or to allow, you know, because it doesn't even go from philosophy to science overnight. It takes centuries of people being able to kind of explore and think a little bit in European universities and other places before they figure out modern scientific methodologies and so on. So, and remember, it's not as if philosophy does all the work for you. Philosophy makes it possible, it can encourage it, but you still need people to make discoveries in economics and make discoveries in physics. And that just takes human effort and genius, right? Which doesn't happen automatically. But there's enough talent in human beings, if they want something and they work hard enough, that if with the proper fundamental kind of soil to grow in, I think we can be optimistic. So one reason things continue to improve is there's a big, it takes a long time. And it's also the case that both what happened in the Enlightenment Industrial Revolution and what happened politically through declarations of the rights of man, and then the United States of America, in a way, keep certain positive things alive. So I think, and I want to say something. It's often that we think of this as, well, technology's still improving, but everything else is getting worse. I don't even think that's true. Like, today, people have more freedom to find a sexual partner that works for them and that accords with their romantic values than any point in human history. That is pretty much an unmitigated good. And it is a cultural achievement and a political achievement. That's really good. I think it's built upon basically Enlightenment views about consent and about choice and so on, and rejecting mysticism in the church, or the church, these religions that are all against it. So,
yeah, and the same thing, I think if you're Black or some other minority, we're not perfect yet. It's still far from that, but I don't know of a culture in human history that was more accepting of differences between human beings and the way we look than probably right now. There's still a way to go, but it's still much better than it's ever been.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think it's there are debates about like how multi-ethnic is the conception of Romans at certain periods, and so on, and so there are places in time where people didn't care about that; they cared about this, which language or which king you had or which religion you worship. So I'm not saying there was like. It may not be the most colorblind that things have ever been, but it is in the sense that people accept that racism is evil and that it ought to be eliminated. That is good, so far as we understand it properly and don't end up encouraging it by reverse.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Let's see. All right, we're gonna have to speed it up.
Okay,
I can ask questions. I've read some people that say popular ideas of Heraclitus, everything is fire, can't step in the same river twice, etc., are based on Plato's misrepresentation, not reality. Thoughts?
Plato has an enormous impact on how people read Heraclitus. So Plato's reading of Heraclitus very much influences Aristotle's, and then Aristotle and his school basically write what becomes the history of early Greek philosophy that everybody works off of. Okay. So they're the reason why we say Heraclitus thought everything was fire. Heraclitus thought everything was everything. And fire in some ways is a nice metaphor for that, but he thinks the death of fire is air and the death of air is water. Like it's all true. It seems to be, some people look at Heraclitus and think, well, he thinks that everything is really one, and apparent opposites are really the same thing, and things are constantly changing, that in that change there is continuity, and that it doesn't seem like Heraclitus draws from this a skeptical further step, that because everything is changing, we don't know anything. That seems to be Plato's take on it, that because the sensible world is always changing, like Heraclitus says, therefore there is no knowledge of sensible things. That part seems to be Plato.
Joseph, Thales said all things are water. Pythagoras said numbers underlie everything.
He didn't.
Okay, but all is the one. Let's see. To identify the human mind works by integration. Explain how integration was a key Greek idea. Okay,
so first off, I want to point out. So there's no evidence. Thales never said everything is water. There's a place where Aristotle is trying to understand, is speculating that Thales might have thought a thing he thought and said, because he might have thought everything was water. What he thought was that things came out of water and perhaps floated on water. And that's just a Near Eastern view. You find that in bits of like the Torah, of like there are waters below and waters above, and then we are in this expanse in the middle. But in any case, okay, so you do see in early Greek philosophy an increasing kind of move of integration. The best example is Thales' student Anaximander. And Anaximander is perhaps the first person to have drawn maps of the world. He has this basic kind of notion, and he introduces, we think, the concept of cosmos. So the word cosmos is etymologically the same as cosmetics, cosmologist and cosmetologist. Originally, it is a word that means to pretty yourself up, to put together your whole ensemble or toilet or something like that, so you're all done up. And Anaximander takes that and thinks all of this is a cosmos. It's a well put together thing. Previous Greek thought talks about an underworld, the earth, the sea, the sky. But there's never a kind of let's step back and say, oh, it's all one thing, and it all works together in some kind of system. So that's an enormous leap forward. And that is, that's the power of integration. Later, like perhaps his student Anaximenes begins to think maybe everything is one kind of thing under various transformations. But I don't think that's in Thales yet. In any case, yeah. So yes, integration is all philosophy is in a sense a massive kind of integration of our whole lives, of our whole universe, of our whole body of knowledge. That's its job.
All right, this is a current event question from Liam. Jennifer Crumley, the mother of the school shooter, was just convicted of manslaughter from the victims her son shot. Is this a rights violation, or should the parents of school shooters be held criminally responsible? Do you know anything about this case?
I don't know very much about this case. So I don't know. I will say this. I think Kyle Rittenhouse's mom, who drove him across state lines knowing he had a gun and wanted to get involved, I think she bears legal liability for some certain things. That might piss off some of your viewers, but look, if you know that your kid has access to a deadly weapon,
yep,
and you don't prevent them from doing it, especially if there are red flags about their mental health, then you bear some kind of legal liability. Absolutely. I don't know if it means manslaughter or something like that, but you did not take steps that were your responsibility that led to somebody else's harm or death. And that's a thing. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree completely. In this case, I think the mother gave him the gun,
Yeah.
and he was clearly showing signs of, craziness, and she neglected, and she didn't follow up, and so she was criminally negligent so yeah, I think I don't know the technicalities, manslaughter, if that's the right thing.
Yeah.
I don't think she bears some responsibility here without any question. And notice that it's almost never the case that parents are criminally charged with a school shooter. I mean, just being bad parents is not a crime. There are a lot of bad parents, and even if you could be a great parent and still have a kid who's a school shooter, so it's that.
Yes.
There's free will, right? We talked about that. So but you are not. So they don't usually prosecute. So when they do, you've got to look a little deeper, and there's probably a reason why.
Yeah,
The justice system is not that nutty that it's completely random these days.
Yeah, my understanding is that the parents in this case basically put the gun in his hands and didn't take it away when they knew there was a decent chance he was going to kill people. It was, yeah. I mean, but again, haven't followed it closely, so don't take my word for it. I can just expound on the general kind of ideas here.
Hugh says, "Great show."
Thank
All
you.
right, now these are lower dollar number questions, so we have to do them faster, right? That's the trade.
Okay.
Right, and there are a lot of them. All right, so I like
Okay.
says, "Hi Jason, what is needed to develop a theory of propositions? Has the necessary work been done in objectivism? Which source would you recommend?" Just an easy one.
Aristotle's De Interpretatione. He, other than just modality, he pretty much worked out the theory of propositions. If at most you might want to say, hey, we could use some stuff about modality and some stuff about conditionals, disjuncts, things like that. But again, that stuff is also kind of worked out in baby logic. So I think we have a theory of propositions. A proposition says of things that they are or are not this way or not this way. That it's a subject and a predication. The predicate. I think that's it. I mean that's what it is. I think that's not
anybody written about that in a modern book, taking Aristotle and maybe integrating that?
Yeah, some people like Scott Soames' not Scott Soames, Summers. Summers is The Logic of Natural Language, which kind of did something that people thought predicate logic, the Aristotelian style, couldn't do. It couldn't do relations, and that's why propositional logic was so much better. And then he showed, no, you could do it. That's nice. A lot of other things. But I mean, honestly, you'll get most of what you need in Aristotle's De Interpretatione. It's really good.
Justin asks, Dr. Rheins, why is anti-Semitism on the rise? Is it worse on the right or on the left? Is Elon Musk a modern day Henry Ford?
It's on the rise because irrationality is on the rise, and it is the lowest hanging fruit of human depravity. In some ways, I mean, it didn't have to be that anti-Semitism became the kind of tribal racist thing that would spread across the globe. It could have been other things, but a certain combination of things did, and it has roots, and people come back to it. Do I think it's worse on the right or on the left? I think in the United States, the bigger threat to individual Jews and their lives and communities is from the right. From foreign policy, it might be vis-a-vis Israel with the left, but it's not as if you should trust Republicans, because for one thing, they made a deal with Netanyahu, and he's dirty as the bottom of my shoe. And on top of that, right, like they have a game plan. Like, they think that for the Christian Messiah to come back, certain things have to happen with Jewish settlers, and then they want to see everybody turn to Christian in Israel. And if that doesn't happen, they're crazy people, so they will do crazy stuff. They're not the friends of Jews in a deep sense. They just have a crazy prophecy about how all this has to unfold for Christian world domination. There's a lot on the left, and anti-Zionism is an anti-Semitism. Well, there are sometimes you have a distinction without a difference. I mean, if you look at the standards by which Zionism is held versus every other kind of nationalism, it doesn't add up. But clearly, Judaism plays a role. But some of it, I think, in your own work has shown, I think, that to some extent it's more about altruism and the fact that Israel is a successful state and the Palestinians are the oppressed. That actually, it's more like Leninism that drives some of this than perhaps anti-Semitism. And then I have no respect for Elon Musk. I know many objectivists see a lot more quality in him. He is, I think, if there was anything ever any good about him, I think it's gone. Look, just to have that kind of disregard for your employees and your shareholders, like, you just don't give a shit about the jobs you will cost them, the wealth you will cost them, by just throwing the value of your company out the window by saying whatever pops into your head. You cannot be a just person and do that. Mm-hmm. You can't be an honest person and do that. That is really nihilistic. And the thing is like, you might say, hey, it's his company. Yeah, but he has moral responsibilities to those people, and sometimes legal responsibilities, and he doesn't care.
Yep. All right, let's see.
And yes, I think he has Twitter just to extend, his own crazy thoughts, which includes more and more far right-wing stuff, and Twitter has gotten really crap because of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has a certain genius, but he's also, when it comes to politics or any expression of ideas, it's whatever comes into his mind, and sometimes it's horrible, sometimes it's pretty good, but it's just whatever comes into his mind. There's no system, there's no, and that has driven him to the right. It could have driven him somewhere else. It really is kind of whatever occurs.
I think so.
So Gladawar says, influence of Greeks by Egyptian philosophy. Is there such a thing as Egyptian philosophy?
There's Egyptian religion, there's Egyptian mathematics. I don't know that it reaches a point. You can kind of call it that, though it's not really what the Greeks have. I will say there's Chinese philosophy, there's Indian philosophy. I don't really think there's something that reaches the level of philosophy in ancient Egypt, but it's not my area. There are a couple things. There is a conversation between a man and his pa, which is kind of philosophical and reflective. there are certain fairly, social themes in the tale of the eloquent peasant. So some of it, Middle Egyptian literature, actually is kind of bright. Okay, did it influence the Greeks? The Greeks, there isn't philosophical influence, but it seems that overwhelmingly it's more from Babylon and Persia. Now, when the Greeks don't know who they got an idea from, but know they got an idea from somewhere else, they default to saying it came from the Egyptians. It's a trope. So when Herodotus is talking about the belief that the soul is immortal and reincarnated, he says it came from Egypt, and then certain people introduced it, Pythagoras, right, to the Greeks. He doesn't name Pythagoras by name. Now the thing is that there's reason to think reincarnation was not an originally Greek idea, and the Egyptians have a very, very complex and robust eschatology, but it doesn't involve reincarnation. So that's just like, so every ancient Greek sage went to Egypt and learned, and the Greeks say this. The thing is that like, that's not like, that's the Greeks yada yadaing their own ignorance of where this stuff comes from. It doesn't actually mean the Greeks stole all this Egyptian wisdom, but they took and often acknowledged other influences.
Justin asks, you'll love this one. Oh, wait, what is the philosophy behind MAGA? What is Trump's personal philosophy? Why did the conservative movement give up on liberty in 2016?
I don't think Trump has a philosophy. I think Trump has neurosis. I think Trump, at any given moment of Trump's existence, there is an overwhelming, because there's overwhelming evidence from his entire life that he's a piece of shit and that everything he says about himself is a lie. And he feels a constant need to keep that lie going to evade from himself the fact of his own wretchedness. And I think every single thing he does, every lie he makes up, every outrageous thing comes from this desperate attempt to keep running from his own awareness and shove it down. And the MAGA movement is an attempt to make this man's insanity a reality. But building on the fact that it cues into their racism, their conspiratorial thinking, okay, it's not a philosophy, but you can talk about elements of it. It is anti-elitist, but anti-expertise. So yes, bi-coastal elites can be smug, and some of that smugness is values that are mistaken and wrong. But also, if someone has gone to college or beyond that and can actually do stuff and knows stuff, that is a distinction. And yes, you should respect the experts when the experts tell you about certain things. So there's an anti kind of expertise. There is resentment of the parts of the country that are actually growing and actually producing, as against the Rust Belt, as against places that have never been and never will be anything. And the thing is like the good people, they leave, they move away from these places and they go to cities. And yeah, the rest of the country, which is where our culture comes from, where TV comes from, we think of them as flyover states because they are. And people don't like that. And they didn't like that there was a black president. I mean, I don't have a lot of sympathy. I think it's, to the extent it's a philosophy, it's white Christian nationalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think philosophy is too much of an integration to attribute to them. It's fear and hatred is drives much of it, and the fear comes from lots of different places, and the hatred comes from lots of different places.
Yeah.
And they found somebody to reflect that back to them, and he runs on that. He knows exactly. I mean, that's a sense in which he is brilliant. He knows exactly how to push their buttons. And he understands. Rand has something about, being a people's person, knowing people and how to, I think she talks about TUI that way. Trump has that, not intellectual level, but at a kind of a visceral level.
I see. Here's the thing. I actually think it's a further condemnation of all of his followers and enablers that he's gotten this far, because I don't even think he has that. Like, if you're like, he has some shrewd sense of, I don't think he has any shrewdness. Like, I think a person who's even remotely shrewd would not constantly say the same self-incriminating things. I think it's they are so enamored with the fact that he will do awful things that they want that they keep that going. Like, for example, okay, I know we have to go quick, but this is good. So I heard a story about somebody that was being approached by the Trump administration. They wanted him to come in, and this person was a very successful business leader. And Trump told him this story, and in this story, Trump was trying to not pay a bank or something that he owed money to the full amount. And so he was negotiating back, and they wanted to get some of it back. And he said, well, and then Trump says, all right, well, how about for that last $1 million, we flip a coin? And the banker, as Trump's telling, says, okay, fine. And then Trump brags to this person he's trying to recruit that it was a fake coin, or that he lied about the flip. Right? So, like, look, I got it over on this. Now, here's the thing. Not only is Trump admitting I'm a cheater to this person, but he's doing it in a stupid lie that no one would believe. There's no way some bank executive was like, okay, the last $1 million, we'll flip for it, Donald. That didn't happen. So he made up a 5-year-old's lie, like the kind of dumb lie a 5-year-old tells you. Like, how did these cookies get here? Oh, well, this thing, you know, like, you're not smart enough to know that lie can't be convincing. And one that's supposed to make him look superior because he did this incredibly ethical thing, only it never happened, right? That's him. That's not clever. That's not reading people. If he could read people, he'd know not to ask, you know, the generals who are never going to go along with X to do X. I think he's a rabid dog who stumbled into a place that was ready to make a rabid dog emperor.
Yep. All right. Favorite historian history book recommendations?
Ooh, there are a lot of really good ones. I love, there's a book by Friedman called Who Wrote the Bible? Friedman's gone a little wacky more recently, but he's a Bible scholar. It's about what we call the documentary hypothesis. That is that key parts of the Old Testament, what Jews call the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, that they are written by several different authors, and how we know and what we can reconstruct about who these authors were and what their agendas were. It is one of these very rare books that is pitched at a level that a popular audience can understand it, and simultaneously make scholarly advances in the field. That's, you know, like, there's The Origin of Species. There aren't many books that can boast doing that. It's really great. I really like, my favorite history textbook is Palmer and Colton's European History. I love it's a classic. I love it. I like those are a couple. And then you could ask me specific issues, but I really like those.
Great. Dr. Rheins, have you read Brian Kaplan's Case Against Education? Do you agree that there are too many people going to universities?
I didn't read the book, but I got familiarized with his arguments and views when I was working for Higher Grounds Montessorium. And I think some of his points are good and some of his points aren't. I think in some ways he's too dismissive or has too narrow a view about what the point of education should be. So when it doesn't do X, you know, he thinks it's a failure. But I do think that it's yeah, I mean, I think this is hardly a new take, but America has underproduces skilled tradespeople, and we send people to get undergraduate degrees who aren't interested in learning more school stuff, and it's kind of a waste of their time, and that's true. The problem is that we have so failed in primary and secondary education that they're basically learning in college what they should have learned as high school students. So in that sense, no, I don't think it's I think everybody should be getting that much kind of education. It's just to go on with it, yeah, no, that's probably a mistake.
Michael asked, did Ayn Rand come too late? Was the only way for America to be saved from Atlas Shrugged is to have been written in 1857, not 1957?
I don't know. I will say this. Since 2016, I have been way more worried and pessimistic than I was before then. And it's not like I foresaw great things for America's future. It's just I thought the decline would continue to be the slow corrosion. I didn't think it would start heading for Nazi Germany at a breakneck pace. So that's worrisome. And I think hindsight will be 2020, and we'll be able to say yes or no. But I don't know. And
I'm not sure she could have written it in 1857.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I mean, she herself
true.
claimed she needed the Industrial Revolution in order to write it. So it's one of those hypotheticals that are.
Yeah.
All right. Glad of War says Jason.Thucydides and God, I can't pronounce this.
Who?
Diodorus?
Which one? Diodorus the atheist? Diodorus Siculus?
Significant. Was those two significant?
Okay.
Diodorus Solicitus.
Diodorus Siculus? That's different. I mean, he's for history, he's important. I couldn't make out who the first is supposed to be. Can you type it in chat?
You'd think I'd studied. Maybe I never studied phonics. It's quite possible. Let's put this in chat. Okay, how do you pronounce that?
Oh, Thucydides.
Oh, okay. Well, you'd say that.
Yeah. So so these are Greek historians. So they're very significant. And I kind of prefer Thucydides. For historians after Thucydides, I prefer Polybius, but Diodorus Siculus is important. They're very important. Thucydides becomes the model in many ways for secular history for the rest of the Western tradition. And it's not just that, Herodotus is too much of a fabulous, too much myth. It's, in a way, Herodotus is sort of doing history, but he's sort of doing ethnography and just a bunch of different things. But yeah, I mean, they're very important, I guess.
Right. So are you familiar with the ancient Chinese philosopher Lao Tzu? Some say he's the first libertarian thinker.
Okay. I don't know if it's there's Lao Tzu, you know what? Lao Tzu. Oh yeah. So there's some people think he's an atheist. An egoist, like an ethical egoist, and that so it's sometimes said that Confucianism was meant to be a kind of middle path between Lao Tzu's egoism and the extreme altruism of Moism. So if you want something that's as altruistic as Christianity, Moism in China was that. I don't know enough about him to say anything important other than I've heard of him and I hear it's pretty egoistic, but I don't know.
Yeah, when I was in China, the Chinese free market intellectuals all thought that he was a significant kind of advocate of liberty and freedom, individual liberty and freedom.
I mean, look, there is tradition of Confucians as against the legalist school that wanted state power. Mm-hmm. The Confucians often were the defenders of the free market, of trade, and other things. So there is a robust history of that in Chinese thought, and maybe he's a part of it. Once you get, east of the Jordan River, I haven't heard of it. I mean, not or Persia maybe, but yeah.
All right, Justin asked, was homosexuality rampant in ancient Greece and Rome?
So there's always been homosexuality, and my guess is there's always been probably about as much as there is now, just because people tend to act on their sex drives, and it's a shame when they can. So in Greek and Roman culture, they don't think of homosexuality the way we do. That's the important thing. So, for example, we tend to think that regardless of the biological sexes or genders of the people involved, if you have an adult and a minor, it's wrong. And then many of us think if it's two consenting adults, it's at least not, maybe not everything about it is great with the psychology, but at least it's not wrong. And, I mean, like somebody is taking advantage of something, but like, now that's not how the Greeks think. The Greeks think that two grown men, two Greek citizens cohabitating as sexual partners is weird and bad, but a 30-year-old Greek man with an 18-year-old boyfriend might be okay and good. And the reason that the difference is that there is a kind of clear dominant and subordinate, or top and bottom, in that relationship. And when they think about male sexuality, that's an important kind of component. So the idea is, once you're an adult male, you shouldn't be submitting to someone. You should not be anybody's bottom. But that's okay when you're younger and so on. And it's complex because there are people in ancient Greece who had relationships like a modern homosexual relationship, and then you have the pederastic relationship. The main thing is that the lines are not the same as we think about them. And here's another way. When we think, if you're essentially gay, or essentially lesbian, and and you're married to someone of the opposite sex, we think of this as inauthentic, as problematic, and so on. For the Greeks and the Romans, if your main romantic interest is your boyfriend, but you also fathered children with your wife, that's fine.
Yeah. All right. Friend of Aristotle says, no question, just an appreciation to both of you. Thanks, friend of Aristotle.
Thank you.
Justin said, should UPenn fire Amy Wax?
She's I think she has tenure, and that's hard.
Definitely has tenure.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, look, she's awful. But what they, in a just world, they probably would and could, but she has a contract, and
they can't. Justin says, there are many modern historians who claim that the Dark Ages wasn't as terrible as we previously thought. What say you?
Depends. Like we've found pockets of things that weren't as bad as some of the things we thought. But compared to the Roman Empire, it was a big step backwards in just about every appreciable way, from public health to education to art. Things got worse in Western Europe. They didn't get as bad as quickly in some places as others. There were places that stayed pretty civilized in the eastern part of the empire. But yeah, by and large, I think it got bad in some places, very, very
bad. Is Batman an objectivist hero? Is he inspired by Francisco d'Anconia?
Okay, great. So Frank Miller, who wrote the best Batman comics of the two generations, who basically revived Batman as a character, was clearly, and he's admitted, influenced by Ayn Rand. So Batman Year One and The Dark Knight Returns and The Dark Knight Strikes Again, especially, you can really see Rand's influence. Okay, now, Batman the character is based off of Zorro. Zorro is based off of the Scarlet Pimpernel, and the Scarlet Pimpernel is based on Schiller's Fiesco. And Rand read that. She probably also read Orczy's Scarlet Pimpernel, and those are part of the inspiration for Francisco d'Anconia. I should add that Fiesco itself is inspired by the legend of Lucius Junius Brutus, the founder of the Roman Republic, who pretended to be an idiot for many years while he slowly prepared to overthrow the Tarquin monarchy. So it all goes back to Lucius Junius Brutus.
Oh, okay.
But is Batman? Yes, Batman is awesome. Batman can take down Superman, who is a living god. Why? Because Batman is a smart man, and a smart man can defeat a living god. It helps that he has all that money and gadgets, but he invents those gadgets. And even though he pretends to be a fool, a foppish, guy, he keeps Wayne Enterprises in the black. So Absolutely. He's awesome. Batman is awesome.
Yeah,
I mean, he needs to see a therapist. But
yeah, I think Frank Miller does too.
What were you going to say about Frank Miller? Did you ever get to meet him? Know him?
I didn't, but I've met people who've met. I've met people who met Frank Miller, and there's a wackiness there, which is not surprising given what he's written. Why did the Enlightenment rise in a Christian civilization? I think we've actually answered this. I think we did that earlier.
Because it was becoming less of a Christian civilization.
Yeah. Is Peterson trying to revive the Dark Ages? I think that's Jordan Peterson.
Yes.
Do you think he's explicitly trying to revive the Dark Ages?
Not explicitly, but
he's not aware of it. In other words.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, from his theism to his toxic masculinity stuff, that's actually what it means to be a man. To these weird mythic constructs. He's anti-Enlightenment.
Yep, very much so. Did Genghis Khan destroy the Islamic Golden Age? We asked that. We did that. All right. Yeah. Is Charles Murray a racist?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes. Yes. And it's not just the bell curve. Like, you go back and look at earlier stuff in his career. There's a track record. There's a trail. He is absolutely a racist.
Ian asked, does Jason play board games? If so, has he ever played the game Pax Renaissance? It was designed by an objectivist named Phil Eklund.
I've never played that. I'm a geek. I like video games. I love tabletop RPGs, Dungeons and Dragons and all those other things. And I played all those. I'm not as big of a board game player. There are a few I like. I have not played that. I would try it. I would try it.
Pax Renaissance is called. All right, Frank says, before Rand taught us egoism, the French philosopher Helvetius discussed egoism. Have you come across his work, especially in English? What do you think?
I haven't read him. I'm aware of him and others. Not having read him, I really can't say anything about him specifically, and I won't. I will simply say that the vast majority of egoistic, particularly explicitly egoistic thinkers prior to Rand are often very disappointing. The ones in a way who are best, Aristotle and Spinoza, and there are things about their ethics that are not great at all, but they're healthier, and it's, you could look at the person that they're talking about as a moral ideal and not think that's a disaster. You can think, oh yeah, that's pretty good. So I don't know about Helvetius in particular.
Glad of war. Objectivism's impact on how you study and teach history.
Oh, profound. I was interested in philosophy before I found objectivism, and I was reading it, in high school. But I think, I was about 18, summer before college. I read Atlas Shrugged, and then I read everything Rand had written that I could get my hands on, and other things. And so it was formative in my philosophical and historical development. But I've never, I've always kind of thought, when it comes to, so her philosophy is in the background of my own kind of philosophy, my own concepts, my own idiolect, if you will, when I read a philosopher. And that makes a difference. But I would say that I have tried, and I think I have kind of kept separate her view about the history of philosophy. Like, when I come to history of philosophy, I'm just like, all right, I just want to look at it and, European history. And then there are places where I might agree with things she says or that Leonard says, and places where I disagree. But the overall influence of her philosophy is very significant there. Let me give you one, though, like, little thing. So I was as an undergraduate, my honors thesis was on Aristotle's metaphysics. Book Gamma, that's where the law of non-contradiction is. It's like the most objectivist-y thing in Aristotle you can find. And I loved it. And in graduate school, partly because of who I was working with, but also for these other reasons I'll say in a second, I moved away from working on Aristotle and turned to Plato. And part of the reason was I realized at a certain point that when there was a kind of interpretive ambiguity, I found myself too drawn to giving Aristotle the good answer, the right answer. And I knew that was not objective as a historian. That was not what a historian should do. And with Plato, as also with Kant, I was sort of free in a way. Like, they could say something better than I was expecting. They can say something worse than I was expecting.
You wouldn't
I wasn't
bias
as
towards the
invested.
negative? You didn't have the same kind of bias, but on the other side?
Maybe a little, but not nearly as strong. Because look, I mean,
Yeah.
I know they're geniuses, so
Yeah.
if they get some things right, why is that a surprise, right? If they're insightful, you'd expect it.
No, that makes sense. And plus, this Aristotle is an element of hero worship, right?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Now, people think that, I mean, some people have heard my Plato's theology, and they think, oh, you're trying to make him worse. And I'm like, I wasn't setting out to like make him look more like a modern Christian or something like that, because I thought it's much more like I wanted to understand where certain ideas came from. I was very interested in evolutionary biology. I was interested in intelligent design. I wanted to know who's responsible for this disaster. And it turned out it's him. It's Plato. But like, I didn't make that up, and I'm not pushing him into something that I don't think is there. It's there. People just didn't adequately appreciate how important it is to him in what's there.
Daniel says, Arthur Herman's In the Cave in the Light spoke of a parallel between Heraclitus, the way Heraclitus used logos, and the Taoist concept of Tao. Both those share metaphysics of change. Thoughts on this connection?
Yeah, I mean, Sivan and Lloyd seem to talk occasionally about stuff that might be there. So it is both the case of early Taoist texts and the case of the fragments of Heraclitus that they are highly enigmatic, and that people in their own times say things like, what the hell are they talking about? In the case of Heraclitus, I can read the Greek and say for my own stuff, yeah, what the hell was he talking about? I can't do that with the ancient Chinese. So I've only read it in translations, and it's not like the translations sound similar to one another. It's like, you're like, I don't know. So I don't know. But from when the first time I read some Taoist early stuff, I was like, wow, this sounds a lot like Heraclitus. Take that for what you will. Some people do think that his logos, or the way unity and change, is like the Tao, and maybe it is.
Mm-hmm. That was Daniel. Let's see. Glad of War. Did Kant's philosophy have an impact on slavery?
No.
either way?
I don't think it had any impact on it one way or the other.
Also glad it was
Oh,
thoughts.
Except this. To the extent that you think that, like, founding documents, say for the UN, had a role in stamping out any slavery that remained in certain parts of the globe or something, but I don't think so. But yeah, no, I don't think so. I mean, if you wanted to argue Kant's responsible for the rise of collectivism, and collectivism has, without calling them slaves, enslaved hundreds of millions of people, then yes. But as bad as his influence is, Kant's political philosophy is not what came after. In ways, he allows it to happen, but you have to be fair and say he wanted, he was still advocating in certain ways for individual rights, as bad as ethically he was.
Thoughts on Bruce Gilley's case for colonialism?
Don't know it. But yeah, I don't know it.
W.C. Zian, reading Will Durant's Life of Greece is a dense and hard to retain. What themes and ideas should I look out for to build an integrated understanding as opposed to a haze of concrete?
I'm not a huge fan of the Durants. I think they had a nice impact on, like, extending certain things at a certain time, but I like it's I prefer, if you want a kind of big overview of Greece, it's dated. There are things that are not quite right, and it's a little over romanticizes the Greeks. But HDF Kitto, Kitto's The Greeks. It's a very slim volume. It's very beautiful, and he was a serious classicist, and I think it has some of the really nice themes. Here's the other thing I will highly recommend. Yale has various courses that they've put online for free. You can get them on YouTube. And the course on Greek history by Donald Kagan is excellent and covers a lot of the Kagan, Donald Kagan, Yale open courses. His course on Greek history, it's great. It's just great.
Good.
Way better way to learn it.
Okay, Rob asks, thoughts on Marshall McLuhan and Irving Goffman?
Okay. McLuhan, I at least tried to read a little bit of his famous book. I thought it was largely gobbledygook. Hot and cool culture. What the hell is he talking about? He was influenced by a very interesting classicist who was also at Toronto at the time, named Havelock, who wrote the Greek liberal tradition, or liberalism, something like that, which in part was about something I was talking about earlier, about there's this lost voice of, like, the pro-freedom Greeks, the pro-democracy Greeks. Havelock was talking about that, but Havelock also connected it with the shift between oral culture and literate culture, and that influenced McLuhan. And it's not as if nothing changes in a culture when you change the medium, but I tend to think that no, the medium is not the message. If the message were better, the medium would carry it, and so on. Like, I think if we lived in a different kind of intellectual era, people would be using the internet differently. You'd have everything you have now, but you'd also have higher brow stuff. Goffman, I understand for, what is it, stage theory, basically about social roles and masks. I just don't know very much about it. I think one can go too far in talking about performing roles and things like that, but it is fair to say that in say certain family dynamics, people take on certain roles, sometimes that they're not aware of. It's also fair to say that people often want to project and do project a version of themselves that may or may not be exactly who they are. Sometimes it's who they want to be. Sometimes it's who they want to be seen as. And it's something that psychologists should pay attention to, and I'm glad they do. But did Goffman do a great job of it? I have no idea. I don't.
All right, this is MES. How do you think Christianity plays a role in Latin America's impoverishment and consistent popularity of socialism in these countries, and what makes American Protestant Christianity different?
I would be shocked if Catholicism. I'm sure Catholicism has a lot of influences. I also think being under Spanish rule as against English rule also, or French rule also had a role in some of this. Look, if you look at the Pilgrims, okay, in Massachusetts, they were nuts. They were, they were the English version of the Taliban. They weren't quite that violent, but they were nuts. They wanted to have a theocratic state, and it's much more, other later English and other colonists that who are more of a sane kind of age of reason British, that help to build America as a kind of country of enlightenment. And yeah, I mean, I don't. Let me say this: I don't know enough about Latin American history to know why, after Bolivar, you didn't get republics that were able to move in the direction of the United States. I assume some of it is that, you probably didn't have the same kind of middle class there that you had in the colonies, and some of it's Spanish rule, and some of it's probably the church. But I honestly, something clearly wasn't there that was in our colonies, and some things went wrong but didn't go wrong here, but I don't know exactly what they are.
And it could be related to Catholicism and its hierarchy and authoritarianism that is a little different than the Protestants, or the better Protestants.
I mean, it has a way. I mean, so it is true that, there's this Protestant work ethic, and it's also true that the church, where it exists, tends to gobble up a lot of resources and sit on a lot of capital. And it makes gestures at relieving the poor, but doesn't actually lead to anything that gets them out of poverty, ever. So,
well, and I mean, it's a whole interesting topic, but Protestants also disagree with one another all the time. So they're like 1,000 Protestant sects.
Yeah.
So there's a lot less centralization of power. There's a lot less hierarchy and authority than there is under the Catholics, where it's one dogma and they disagree, but they still refer to the hierarchy. Is evolutionary psychology a pseudoscience?
Pseudoscience or junk science. To the extent that those are two different things, I don't know which to call. It's junk. So that some things about the capacities that we humans have are the results of evolutionary forces, sexual and natural selection. Yeah, probably. Or yes. But that you can take some alleged trait that they never even show is actually a trait, that is distributed among humans regularly, and that's some biological reason as against an incredible amount of culturation, and that's due to the made-up story about the deep past of human beings that they don't actually know, but they're making up. That any of that is even plausible. That's not science. And most of evolutionary psychology, I'm sorry to say, is this modern gender bias that I believe in. How can I explain that as the gender bias of cavemen?
Yep.
And that's what it is. It's like, how come guys are jerks and won't call a woman for a month? Well, because cave guys who were cave jerks screwed more cave women in that month before they called. And so they had more descendants, which is why guys today, and like every bit of this is just made up and doesn't explain anything.
Yep. All right. Boaz has the regular question. Tips for tired parents and thoughts on virtual reality, artificial intelligence, Bitcoin, and New York City.
New York City, I love it. I'm a New Yorker. I still want to say it's the greatest city on earth, but it's very clear that it has not. I mean, at the beginning of the 20th century, it was the greatest city on earth, hands down, and it was growing, and it was the world of the future, and it isn't anymore. And I think that's tragic. I hope I live long enough to see the day when it is again. I love it. I love it with every part of myself. Even the things I hate about it, I love. In a way, it's filthy, and I love it. Okay, Bitcoin. I don't know if you're super clever. Maybe you can make some money. It's not money. I don't think it ever in our lifetimes will be. I honestly think should world governments decide to crack down on it, you'll lose everything you put it into it. I wouldn't bet on it. Oh, and by the way, it's not like the blockchain gives you the anonymity. This will give me anonymity. Like, no, I mean, yeah, you can buy your weed with it or whatever, but like actually it records every transaction. So
absolutely,
you're better off with cash. Okay. What was before that? Tired parents?
AI and virtual reality.
Virtual reality. Yeah, let's see more of it. They've been promising it to us for years. I hear the new Apple thing looks pretty cool. It's AI. I'm not worried about it taking over Terminator style. Could I be wrong? I don't know. I mean, but I still wouldn't think it was conscious, and it would just be like we created this software that's causing huge cascading problems. But in any case, it's pretty cool. I am not impressed by the LLMs. Like ChatGPT does not impress me, like the stuff it comes up with, but DALL-E impresses me, like the image creating things. And I think probably our traditional artists are getting screwed because they were never paid for the data mined from them. But it is quite amazing. I can't draw for shit, and when I want my Dungeons and Dragons players to like see a certain thing, I have no hope of doing it. And then I go to DALL-E and I'm like, give me an elf who's like a KGB agent elf. And I have to change the prompt a couple times, but then eventually I'm like, yeah, that's what I wanted, or more or less. That's amazing. I never would have. That's magic. That's wonderful.
Yep.
Tired parents. I don't have kids. I'd like to one day. I don't know, caffeine.
They need something stronger, I think. All right,
yeah.
Daniel. How long does the Trump ushered in dictatorship last? There's a loaded question.
If it occurs, I hope it doesn't. I really hope. But if it does, I think it's highly unpredictable how long they last. In the sense that some of them, through their own incompetence and internal fighting, collapse very quickly, or they get replaced by another strong man who seizes the military. Yeah. Greece, Athens lost and restored its democracy half a dozen times in 20 years, and so, or not 20, but in other places they get a certain kind of lockdown. And take Iran. Nobody thought before the Iranian Revolution that Khomeini was going to be the person to replace the Shah, and that his crazy version of Islamic fundamentalism was going to dominate. And lo and behold, the Iran is still that, right?
44 years.
Yeah. And I mean, God, and look at North Korea, right? I mean, like it's really hard to predict. I will say this. The opposite of God forbid, like God, give him the stroke that he's already earned, to Donald Trump. I hope he does. But if he were to drop dead today, or if he were to be sent to prison or what have you, we would not be out of the woods. First of all, until the day he dies, Trump will continue to be a cancer in this country. He will tweet. He will send things out from prison. He will agitate, and the MAGA people will love it. They'll lap it up. But even then, once he's dead, there will not be it'll be hard to find a single human being that condenses the same amount of insanity, stupidity, and viciousness that he has. He's like a thought experiment about how many human weaknesses and ills can you fit into one sack of skin. it's quite remarkable if you think about it. And it's just hard to get somebody that bad who isn't already dead, that enough people kept propping him up to keep it going. But you'll certainly see people trying. You'll see DeSantis's, and you'll see Josh Hawley's, and you'll see J.D. Vance's, and you'll see every one of these, Stephen Miller and Steve Bannon, every one of these Nazis, Christian fundamentalists, Mike Johnson, and all these people, and they will try to fill the vacuum, and eventually one of them will. And then we'll have that to deal with. So it's not going to go away until there are better ideas or something to replace it. My hope is that enough never Trump Republicans and middle of the road Democrats. My hope is that that eventually you get a center left party, and then you get more of a far left party, and that's where it kind of goes. Who knows? I don't know.
Yep. Daniel, Iranians are almost universally opposed to the theocratic regime. Any theories as to why? Did remnants of Islamic golden age survive in Persia?
So no, I mean Persia had European education. Persia was really catching up to Europe in the beginning of the 20th century. First of all, Persia has an enormous and highly advanced culture. Within the Islamic world, Persia in some ways was always less. I mean, it's Shia rather than Sunni. It always had more artistic depiction of human figures. There were lots of things about Persia strengths going in. And then on top of it, by the middle of the 20th century, it had a cosmopolitan middle and upper class with European educations and liberal values and stuff. And that went underground, but the Shah but the Khomeini couldn't just wipe it out. That's why they hate him, because now there are classes of people in Iran who being the morality police and harassing women is about the best job they can get, and they are in hock with the state apparatus in that way. And then there are religious people, but it tends to be the less educated and less affluent classes. They continue to kind of pass down more modern values. I think that's why. And it's a shame, because if it weren't, say, Israel and America's worst enemy, it would be our best friend in that region. There could be.
Yeah, absolutely.
Jews and Persians have a long love history, and you can see it in LA today. Los Angeles.
Yeah. A whole holiday around Jews and Persia, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Daniel says, is there any relationship between praxis and praxology, or is it just a superficial etymological connection?
Praxology is from praxis. Praxis, so the Greek verb is pratein. It's doing something, but it's in the sense that an agent does something. So it's like a deed, right? So like an animal doesn't perform deeds. A chair doesn't perform deeds, even if it does something, but a human does. So praxeology is certain kinds of studies of behavior, and so.
WCZN, thanks for the recommendations. And then the last question we have is John Rawls the father of woke? And who is John Rawls?
John Rawls is a very important 20th century political philosopher, many years at Harvard. His greatest distinction is his book from 1975, A Theory of Justice. And it was a version of egalitarianism. It was not the most radical form of egalitarianism. And here is the distinction. At a time when, communists, other very far left people were saying, let's go for equality, even if it makes everybody worse off. Rawls said, hey, let's allow some inequality if any more equality would make the poorest people even more worse off. So there was a sort of like, let's take one step back from the nihilistic abyss vis-a-vis egalitarianism. And the thing is look, center-left people, your typical kind of Democrat, your typical kind of mixed economy, welfare state, social democrat, they were looking for a principled political philosophy that gave them some kind of leg to stand on vis-a-vis against the Marxists for the longest time. And Rawls gave it to them. This was manna from heaven. Look, finally, we don't just seem like wishy-washy. We don't just seem like we're hypocrites. Like, we actually have a philosophy. So Rawls became a kind of really popular version of kind of Kantian social democrat center left. And that's as well as egalitarianism. And some of what he's well known for is egalitarian arguments that furthered egalitarianism. He wasn't, as I've said, the most extreme egalitarian, but he did do a lot to popularize egalitarian political philosophy. He's not the founder of woke. I take it that is much more sexuality, gender, and race are not nearly enough on Rawls's radar screen as compared to class for him to be any way sort of responsible for that. I mean, being an American political philosopher, he's aware of some stuff of race. And, he was aware of, and I think broadly sympathetic with, second wave feminism, as am I, like women should be allowed in the workplace and should be equal to men in those regards, right? Like, yeah, but it wasn't yet, what is gender and sex and so on. So, yeah.
All right. Daniel says you're on. Got to have you on again. Thank you, Daniel. I will. Thank you, Jason.
Thank you. This is a pleasure.
It's fun.
This is really great. I'm sorry if I went on too long with my answers. I tend to do that a little, but
hey, I mean, Lex Friedman has changed the standards. If you're not going 3-4 hours, you're just not doing your thing.
You think that's more him and less? I mean, look, I'm happy to not give Joe Rogan credit for anything. But
as somebody who's never watched Joe Rogan, maybe I'm wrong. I very well could be wrong, and I'm giving false credit. But
God, that Lex Friedman tweet the other day, that was so bad.
Oh, he unfortunately,
on Tucker Carlson, that was awful.
Yeah, he's got some bad stuff on the Israeli-Palestinian stuff. He's just too much looking for a middle road and everybody to be nice to one another, and we need to listen to everybody, and why can't we all get along? Just a little.
I don't trust anyone named Lex. I'm sure that this is because of Lex Luthor, but it's a bias. I don't know how to. Yeah, it's there.
All right, so Stinger Bell has snuck in a question here. Hello, Jason and Yaron. How does Maslow's hierarchy of needs compare and contrast with objectivism?
Well, so couple things. Rand thinks that any kind of human values, even the most basic ones, requires choice and requires knowledge. She makes the point, right? You wouldn't even know what the pain in your stomach meant vis-a-vis hunger if you hadn't acquired the concept and so on. And you couldn't do anything about it if you hadn't learned ways of feeding yourself. Now, it is true that certain needs are needed to get to other things, but I think that in general, Rand thinks that our higher spiritual needs are not more icing on the cake. I mean, maybe Maslow doesn't think so either. Maybe that's not fair to Maslow, but that art and sex and philosophy, that these are the highest sort of needs are certainly part of her thought. I take it that when you get higher and higher into Maslow's needs, it tends to reflect more and more your typical kind of Western philosophy. So probably more altruistic, probably less this, that, and the other thing. But look, it's not a bad thing if people think of building up their needs and seeing spiritual needs as something to build up. I mean, yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I also don't know, like, in what sense it's as a hierarchy, as a developmental scheme that it's right. In other words, sure, like a very young child isn't going to have the same kind of intellectual, spiritual needs as someone older. That much is true, but that it goes in the kind of order that he says, I don't know.
All right. Thanks, Jason. It's late here.
Thank you.
I will see you probably in Austin sometime soon. And
So,
you guys,
yeah,
I will see you guys tomorrow morning.
I
Time tomorrow. Yeah, Jason.
Oh, I should say, I'm going to be at Ayn Rand Con. I'm going to be,
Good.
I'm doing like 4 different talks there on a number of these things. I'm going to be talking about the Greek Enlightenment. I'm going to be talking about the European Enlightenment and those philosophical fault lines in it. I'm doing a panel, or I'm doing a workshop on the European Enlightenment, a general talk on the Greek Enlightenment, another workshop with Ben Baer on the history of Christianity and some of his Dominion stuff, and then a panel with Greg Salmieri and Tara Smith on cultural changes and intellectual patterns and stuff. So if you like this stuff, I'm doing more of it.
Yeah, Ayn Rand conference in Austin. I think it's March 20 something. And
Yeah.
if you are serious about studying objectivism, and I think if you're a student, but maybe if you're not even not a student, but you're serious about studying objectivism, you can get a scholarship. So you can apply at the Aun Rand Institute. So go to ainrand.org/start here, and you can apply for the scholarship. I think you have to do it in the next few days because at some point we run out of time in terms of scholarships. But even if you don't get a scholarship, conference sounds amazing. You guys should just go.
It'll be good.
Have a great night.
Thank you, Yaron. Thank you. Good night.
Bye, Jason. Bye, guys. Thanks to all the super chatters. See you soon.